All right. So thanks to Alex and Andrew and everybody else who was associated with helping organize this. I'm thrilled to be here today and to tell you a little bit about modularity in structural and functional brain networks. Is there a power on this somewhere? Okay, so typically when we study brain networks, we want to characterize their structure and their organization in some way. And we can do this in a lot of different ways. On one hand, we can characterize properties of individual brain areas, nodes in the network. For instance, talking about the number of connections they make, how central they are, or the number of triangles surrounding that node. On the other hand, we can talk about properties that are in some way representative of the network as a whole, like the average number of steps it takes to go from one area to another, or the efficiency with which information might diffuse over the network. With these two scales, node measures that are local and whole brain networks that are global, these constitute extremes along a spectrum. And situated between those two extremes is an extremely rich mesoscale, where rather than focusing on properties of individual nodes or the brain as a whole, we focus on subnetworks. And we call these subnetworks modules or communities, and the complete set of all communities constitutes a partition. So why do we study community structure? Why do we study mesoscale structure? Well, on one hand, it offers a kind of way of reducing the dimensionality of a network. It offers a coarse graining of a network's organization. Rather than focusing on all of the nodes and all of the edges, we can focus on just a few relevant communities. Also, communities, we tend to think of them as constituting functionally related clusters in a network. These are groups of nodes that have dense connections among themselves or some shared connectivity pattern. So we might think that they serve similar functional roles within the context of the network. By studying modules, we also have a way of identifying hubs, and Martin spent some time talking about this morning. We define connector hubs and provincial hubs with respect to modules and with respect to communities. We can also, another reason for studying this is because we can also apply methods for studying community structure to both functional and structural networks, so it's a multimodal approach. And of course, there's the applied side. We want to study how mesoscale structure varies with disease, how it varies with an individual's cognitive state, and over much shorter time scales. So in short, there's lots of reasons why we want to study networks mesoscale and community structure. But the real challenge, of course, is in order to do any of these things, we have to have some way of estimating a network's community structure. We need to know a network's mesoscale structure in order to talk about its hubs or how it reconfigures with disease. So if we encounter a new network, represented by this adjacency matrix, how do we determine its mesoscale structure? And in general, this is something that we can't do upon visual inspection alone. If we looked at that network on the left, you wouldn't immediately recognize that it has these particular clusters, that it has order among its connections. So in practice, rather than detecting community structure and mesoscale structure visually, we do it algorithmically, using a process called community detection. This is where the challenge really begins. In order to detect communities, the user must specify an algorithm, and that algorithm in turn determines what constitutes a community. What is the criteria for a set of nodes to be listed as a community? In most cases, detecting the singularly optimal set of communities is computationally intractable. So from a computational perspective, it's kind of hopeless. And also, the approaches that we use, the algorithms themselves, are sensitive to different parameterizations, whether those parameterizations are explicit or they're encoded some way implicitly in the algorithm. They're prone to biases and sensitivities. So this is the challenge, detecting communities in networks. This is going to constitute the focus of my talk, how we do this in practice for a given brain network. Now, there's lots of ways of detecting communities, but I'm going to focus on one particular approach, the maximization of the so-called modularity function. I'm going to walk through some examples of how we might apply this to structural connectivity data. I'm going to talk about how we can extend the modularity equation, the modularity function, to multi-layer networks, in particular, time-varying functional connectivity. And lastly, I'll discuss a little bit of additional reading, some caveats to everything that I say today. And my goal isn't to give you some kind of definitive roadmap for how to do this on your own, for how to perform community detection. I'm not sure that such a roadmap actually exists. Rather, my goal is to convince you that, one, community detection is a hard problem. It's not easily solved. There's lots of user input and lots of decisions to be made along the way. And that while these decisions, they might seem arbitrary and they might make life challenging, it also renders these approaches flexible, and it makes it accommodating to particular research questions that we might have. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into the modularity function itself. Oh, I might have advanced twice. So how do we detect communities? Well, there's a whole set of algorithms that we can use. There's lots of approaches. There's not a single definitive approach. In neuroimaging, we tend to use InfoMap. That's a popular measure. It's based on, it defines clusters in the network, it defines communities on the basis of how random walkers traverse the network. Communities are groups of nodes that trap random walkers. This results in a hard partition, so every node is assigned to one community and one community only. But there's other methods that allow us to assign nodes to multiple communities, like clique percolation. There's other methods that don't assign nodes to communities at all, and rather they assign edges in the network to communities based on different principles. And there's even other methods too, and I think Dragana's going to talk about this later today, like block modeling. Now, of all these methods, there is one that, for whatever reason, kind of reigns supreme. It's been around for a while, since 2004, and it's eminently cited. Everybody's heard of it in some way or another. This is modularity maximization, which comes from a 2004 paper from Mark Newman and Michel Gervin. And modularity maximization operates on a pretty simple principle at the end of the day. It defines communities to be collections of nodes whose internal density of observed connections is maximally greater than what we'd expect by chance alone. So I'm going to unpack this over the next couple slides. So, what is our observed connections? Well, this is the network that we're studying. In this case, it's an example of a structural connectivity network. I'm going to call this network A. This is our observed set of connections. They may be weighted, they may be binary. This is what comes out of our MRI processing algorithms. We also have to have some sense of what it means for a connection to be expected. So we need a null connectivity model, something that we can generate null networks that preserve some aspects of the original network. And if we were to generate an infinite number of null networks from that particular model, we could average over them and we get some sense as to what the expected weight of every connection would look like. We'll call this matrix of expected connection weights P. So what modularity maximization does, it defines a separate matrix, B, the so-called modularity matrix, which is literally the difference between your observed connections and what you'd expect by chance. And then intuitively, good partitions in the network into communities are ones that cluster the most positive and strongest elements of this modularity matrix within communities. So you can see in the example in the bottom right, the low-quality partition, the red elements, which are those that are stronger than we'd expect by chance, they don't really fall within modules. They don't fall within the boundaries of communities. Whereas the high-quality partition, the strongest elements, the most red elements, are concentrated inside communities. We can formalize this intuition by defining the so-called modularity function. So in this case, Q, this is when we talk about modularity, this is the modularity function. Q is the modularity of a partition. And it's a way of ascribing some quality to a given set of communities. In this case, it ranges from -1 to 1, with a value of 1 indicating that that particular set of communities are better in some sense. They are of higher quality. The value Aij is that observed weight of a connection between a pair of nodes. Pij is the expected. And this gi variable, that's the community assignment of a given node I. And the delta function basically says if two nodes I and j have the same community assignment, the delta function is 1, and otherwise it's 0. Basically, what modularity is doing, what this Q function is calculating, is calculating a sum over all pairs of nodes. If two nodes are in the same community, the delta function is 1, and we add the corresponding element of the modularity matrix to this running sum. We do this over all pairs of nodes, and the final value of that sum is Q, and it tells us the goodness or quality of our partition. So this is basically just a way of grading some partition and some set of communities. And our goal then is to choose the community assignments, choose these values of gi such that Q is as big as possible. It's a pretty straightforward approach. And there's lots of approaches and algorithms and heuristics that we can use to guess those values of gi for all nodes I. Agglomerative clustering, spectral clustering, simulated annealing. There's no shortage of approaches for trying to optimize this Q function. But by far, the most popular, and especially in the neuroimaging literature, is the so-called Louvain method, or the Louvain algorithm. It's exquisitely fast, and under most practical circumstances, it's pretty accurate too. And it works in a pretty simple way. Initially, all nodes are assigned to their own community. Their community assignments are gradually, we test the change in Q after swapping every node's community assignment, and we choose the swap that results in the biggest positive change in Q. We do this for all nodes until no changes are possible, and it gives us some first pass of an algorithm, and it gives us some initial assignment of nodes to communities. This set of communities then gets aggregated to form a kind of meta network where the nodes now represent communities, and we essentially repeat the algorithm, iterating over all pairs of meta nodes now, trying to merge them so that we can get larger and larger values of Q. So it's a greedy algorithm, and in the end we get some mapping of nodes to communities. Okay, well, so now we have a network. This is the same structural connectivity network I showed you before, but with a much more appealing color map. We have some function that grades the quality of partitions, and we have an algorithm for optimizing this. So in principle, we should be able to detect communities in this structural connectivity network. So I want to walk through this process really briefly and highlight some of the challenges that go into this. Okay, so here's our modularity equation. We have our observed network. We want to guess the best possible values of nodes communities. But what about this null connectivity model? PIJ. This is something that we have to specify as users. And it turns out it's an extremely non-trivial decision. What we decide to be our expected weight of a connection, it determines whether the existing connections are expected or unexpected, and that in turn is going to influence the partitions that we detect, the communities that we detect, so it plays a quite big role. And in general, there is no correct null model. This is something that's important, and I really want to emphasize that there is no correct null model, and it's entirely dependent on your research question and context. That said, there's a few models that are quite common. On one hand, this is something that James touched on earlier, we could assume that our networks are generated by totally random and uniform. Basically, edges are generated uniformly and random. This would be an Erdos-Renyi null model. We could have a null model that preserves nodes, degree, or strength sequences, the so-called configuration model or Newman-Girvan model. And I should add that this is the most popular and most commonly used in conjunction with modularity maximization, but for reasons that Andrew and James both touched on, it may be less than appropriate for functional connectivity. We could also have other null models that try to preserve spatial relationships in the network. Again, I want to emphasize that this is something that the user has to decide, and it's entirely context-specific. So let's say we decide we want to use this Newman-Girvan model, just to simplify things. Again, there's lots of options, but to make things simple, let's just use this one particular model. When we run our Louvain algorithm, it gives us some Q value, and you can see next to this adjacency matrix are nodes, module, or community assignments. If we reorder the matrix according to these communities, it looks reasonable. The strongest elements tend to fall within communities. So we should be happy, right? We're done. We have modules. Well, maybe I accidentally execute my code twice, and suddenly I get a second partition of about the same quality as the first. Q1 and Q2 are about 0.4. But if we look at the modules themselves, the module assignments, they're actually different and dissimilar from the first set of modules. Right? But when we consult our network again, it looks reasonable. And we can further show that these are different by computing a community allegiance matrix. So this is a problem, because generally we want to talk about modules as if there's a definitive set of modules, a definitive set of communities for a given network. We don't like this variability. And it turns out this is a well-known problem of modularity. It's something that some people call the near degeneracy of the modularity landscape. And what this means is that there are many near-optimal partitions, all a little bit different from one another. And it's easy to explain why this happens. Imagine you could discover the optimal partition, and you just swap nodes community assignments. So when you make these slight perturbations, you still end up with a high-quality partition, but it's a little bit different. And this problem gets worse and worse the number of nodes you have in your network. So this is something that people know about, but it is a problem. We have many solutions that are dissimilar, but kind of the same. And we can see this if we ran our Louvain algorithm 1,000 times. These are 1,000 different runs, 1,000 different, well, maybe not different, but 1,000 realizations of possible, totally reasonable community structures. And when we look at this community allegiance matrix, we see that there's not total alignment. All the communities the co-assignments of nodes are different in general. So how do we resolve this variability? Well, one opportunity for us is to simply cluster the allegiance matrix directly. Rather than clustering the network itself, we've ran the algorithm 1,000 times in the network, so let's just cluster the allegiance matrix. And this is a process known as consensus clustering, and it's something that we can make compatible with modularity maximization. So basically what we're going to try to do now is to resolve this variability. We're going to try to cluster nodes into clusters, or communities, where the communities correspond to nodes with strong community allegiance. So if we have our observed allegiance matrix, we can randomly permute all of the nodes' assignments and generate an expected allegiance matrix. If we had these same sets of partitions, what would the allegiance be simply by chance? We can define a modularity matrix, the observed allegiance minus the expected, and recluster this matrix using modularity maximization in the Louvain algorithm. And the tendency is for this reclustering process to result in increasingly greater allegiance, greater consistency among the detected partitions. And what we get back then is a single set of consensus modules. So we have a way of getting around this variability and resolving it. Okay, well, now we have consensus communities, so surely we're done. Well, not quite. It turns out modularity maximization has this unique problem. Actually, maybe not unique, but it has a problem. It's called the resolution limit. And I should add, for people out there who are also using the InfoMap algorithm, it has a similar and analogous issue. I'll explain what this issue, what it actually is. Basically, what the resolution limit means is that small communities, even if they are unambiguously defined in your network, under certain circumstances are mathematically not detectable by maximizing Q. And this is a problem. And I'll illustrate it really briefly. So imagine we had a network that looks something like this. These are, around the periphery of this ring are fully connected cliques. So every node is connected to every other node, and those cliques are linked to one another by single edges. Intuitively, if I were to run modularity maximization on this network, what I would expect is to recover each clique as its own module. That would make most sense, right? But in reality, under certain circumstances, if the number of cliques and the size of the network is just right, modularity maximization will actually merge these these cliques together to form two clique kind of communities. And this is bad. It's bad because the modules that we're detecting by maximizing Q, it means they may not reflect these intrinsic communities that we planted in the network. They may not reflect the true community structure in a given network. So modularity maximization may be misleading us in some sense. How do we overcome this? This doesn't totally overcome the issue, but it helps us get around the issue of detecting smaller communities. But the way we can do this is by adding a resolution parameter to our modularity our modularity expression. So here is our original modularity. It's defined as before. What we're going to do is add this gamma parameter. And basically what this gamma parameter does is it's going to scale the importance of our expected connectivity. So if we have a gamma that's really small, we get a modularity matrix that looks like this, where almost all connections are greater than we'd expect by chance. At gamma equals 1, we recover the original kind of default settings. But as we make gamma bigger and bigger, it becomes more and more difficult for connections to exceed what we'd expect in the null model. So the effect then is that when we maximize modularity for larger values of gamma, the number of modules that we detect increases, and the average size of a module decreases. And you can see this here illustrated in these examples. I'm not going to go through how to choose the value of gamma. Generally, it's done heuristically or via some kind of cross-validation, or if you're like me, you might just embrace the multi-scale nature of communities and allow yourself to define some coarse and some fine. But I also want to emphasize that a gamma of 1 is not a special value in this case. At a gamma of 1, you might actually be obscuring your network's true community structure. So this is a challenge that we have to contend with. At this point, let's say we've resolved the variability, we have some consensus modules, and we're content with a particular value of gamma. Now we can go about doing some of the things that we wanted to do, like identifying influential nodes in the network and hubs. I'm actually not going to spend much time on this because I think Martin did a very good job this morning. This is basically covering what he showed in terms of hub classification with participation coefficient and the within module degree z-score. But basically, based on the modules that we detect, we can classify nodes as hubs or periphery, provincial, connector, or even kinless hubs, for instance. So just to summarize this first section, there are lots of methods for studying and detecting mesoscale structure in networks. The modularity queue is just, optimizing the modularity queue is just one approach to getting a good partition of your network into communities. In general, larger values of Q correspond to internally dense and externally sparse communities. Maximizing Q is challenging, so we have to use heuristics. And in order to do this, we have to consider a few things. We have to consider what our null model is going to be. We have to come up with some way of circumventing the non-deterministic nature of our optimization algorithms. We have to have a way of dealing with this so-called near degeneracy of partitions. We need to deal with the scale and resolution at which our modules are detected. So at this point, are there any questions, or we could wait till the end? I don't know. Okay. So all of this that I've shown so far was with respect to single-layer networks. Now I want to talk about how to extend modularity maximization to multi-layer networks. And I'll give a quick example using so-called time-varying functional connectivity. So modularity works on a simple principle, basically comparing what we observe with what we expect. But as I've described it, it only works for single-layer networks. But there's lots of examples in neuroscience and psychology where connectivity information isn't encoded in just one scale or in one layer. For example, we could take bold activations, window them, and for each window compute a correlation matrix, a functional connectivity matrix. And these connectivity matrices corresponding to different time points could represent different layers in a multi-layer network. We could also have cases where layers represent different association modalities, different connectivity modalities, like functional connectivity, correlated patterns of gene expression, or structural connectivity. We could also go totally crazy and make our layers correspond to individual subjects. But in short, there's lots of ways to generate multi-layer matrices, multi-layer networks in neuroscience and psychology. Now, in principle, we'd like to have some way of tracking how communities change across layers, across time, across connection modalities, across individuals. But how do we do this? If we just average across layers, we might lose out on some information. And because a lot of networks really are fundamentally multi-layer, averaging across layers takes away from some of that realism, which is a problem. Fortunately, we can use modularity maximization to kind of rescue us. All we need to do modularity maximization is a modularity matrix and an optimization algorithm. So let's suppose we have, in this example, 4 time-varying functional connectivity matrices. Let's say that we have the power to make them, for each of them, a single-layer modularity matrix. This is the observed time-varying functional connectivity minus some expected. What we're going to do is embed them in a giant modularity matrix. We're going to put them on the diagonal like this. So what would happen if we were to maximize the modularity of this giant matrix? Well, because all the off-diagonal blocks contain only values of 0, there's no reason to merge nodes from one layer to another. There's no reason to have nodes in one layer at one time point be in the same community as nodes in another layer. Because it can't increase Q at all. But what we can do is we can add interlayer links, where we link node I to itself in one layer with itself in another. And we can do this in a couple of different ways. Either in the top, shown in red, is a so-called temporal links, or we could also do it categorically, shown in blue in the bottom triangle. But by adding these links, if the links are strong enough, there's actually an advantage now to merging communities in one layer or merging nodes in one layer with nodes in another into the same community, because it can actually increase Q. Those interlayer links are unexpected in some sense. So let's apply this to some time-varying functional connectivity data. And we're going to try to address the questions of whether mesoscale structure, whether communities are invariant across time, and then can we identify which brain areas module assignments are most and least variable. So the first challenge is we have to come up with a way of generating intra-layer modularity matrices, one for each time point. And it turns out this is more complicated for signed matrices, like correlation matrices that contain both positive and negative values. The typical approach, although there are many, and this is kind of contentious, is to separate the positive and negative correlations. And for each of them, define a separate positive modularity matrix and a separate negative modularity matrix for the negative correlations, and to combine them. We can talk more afterwards about how to combine them and how to reweight their relative contributions. But in short, this is the kind of modularity matrix we might define for a single layer correlation matrix. Now we have to determine what the interlayer connections are going to look like. So on one hand, we could connect every layer to every other layer, in the so-called categorical sense. That's shown in the bottom triangle. Because this is a temporal network, we might want to enforce this temporal progression of layers. So what we might do is we might make the so-called temporal interlayer links, where layer 1 is linked to layer 2 because 1 precedes 2, time point 1 precedes 2, 2 to 3 because time point 2 precedes 3, and so on. Then we have to decide how we're going to weight these interlayer links. We can make the links be very weak, and at this point what we end up getting, if we were to maximize the modularity for this particular matrix, we get communities that are fairly unique to each layer. Alternatively, if we made those links very strong, it could be the case where we're essentially emphasizing community structure that's shared across layers. We'll get very consistent communities across layers. And I'll add that some of the same challenges we showed with the single layer case apply to the multi-layer case as well. The communities we detect depend on our choice of null model. There will be a near degeneracy of solutions, and there will also be a corresponding resolution limit. Let's say we can resolve these, and in this case, let's specify our interlayer links to be a kind of an intermediate value. We can talk more about what that actually means. But if we choose an intermediate value, what we see is there are, on the x-axis, we're looking at layers, and on the y-axis, we're looking at nodes. And the colors denote a node's community assignment over time, over the course of different layers. And you'll see that some communities persist over the entire block, like the yellow community, and in some cases the blue. But there's others that appear only intermittently, like the cyan or red community. So let's look at two of those, two successive time points, two successive layers. What can we talk about the stability of communities across time? Well, because they're nearby one another temporally, they tend to be really similar. But there are some nodes whose community assignments differ. These are shown in red, whereas from one layer to next, the blue communities are the same. We can do this for all consecutive layers, and then we could calculate on average how often a node changes its community assignment from one layer to the next. And this is the flexibility measure that appears in a lot of Danny Bassett's work. And if we do this and we project it back to the brain, we see that, in this case, primary sensory systems like visual and somatomotor are the least flexible. They tend to maintain a consistent community assignment across time, whereas some of these higher order cortices are much more variable. We could get a smoother picture if we were to repeat our optimization algorithm many times and average the flexibility scores. And I should add that the nodes that appear flexible and those that appear inflexible, they kind of depend on our choice of interlayer coupling. So if we make it weak, we might get a different set of flexible nodes versus strong. This is an important point to consider. So a quick summary. Yeah, we can extend modularity maximization to multi-layer networks. There's some additional considerations that we need to think of, basically how to define interlayer coupling and how to choose its weights. But it has all of the same issues as the single-layer modularity maximization, like null model, degeneracy of solutions, and the nature of the scale of detected modules. So now I want to have one last slide of kind of like some additional thoughts, some caveats to everything I said, and talk a little bit about some things that I didn't talk about in the previous two examples. So things I didn't talk about. I didn't really explain how to compare communities across individuals. I didn't explain that in even total random networks, we can actually have very high values of Q, so we need to be wary of this. And I also didn't talk really about the strategies for choosing the resolution parameter gamma or the interlayer coupling parameters. I'll leave this for some offline discussions. But I wanted to talk now about two other important points. First, everything I talked about was in the context of modularity maximization, which assumes that communities should be internally dense and externally sparse. In general, there are many different ways communities can interact with one another, and they don't have to follow this internally dense, externally sparse kind of structure. We can have, for example, cores that are densely connected that project down to a sparsely connected periphery. We can have the exact opposite of assortative communities, where nodes in the same community actively avoid making connections with one another. Of course, we can have some mixture of this too. So the notion that all communities should be internally dense and externally sparse, it's a requirement that's imposed on our communities by the modularity maximization algorithm. And there's lots of ways to be flexible around this. The final point I want to make is that it turns out community detection itself is actually an ill-posed problem, and there's no unique solution. So this further motivates studying different algorithms and different approaches for defining communities. So we can think of community detection, or actually the networks that we're trying to detect the communities, as having some true community structure, lowercase g, and then some function that maps that community structure to a set of edges among a set of vertices. All right, so that's our observed network. Here's some function that takes our communities to that network. Community detection, then, is kind of trying to invert this process. We want to observe our network and try to infer those true underlying set of communities. This requires us to implicitly or explicitly specify that generative process. We need to guess at what that function f actually is. And it turns out there's no unique solution. This has been proven recently. There are many functions that could take the same set of communities and give us the exact same network. And similarly, there are potentially many different sets of communities that the same function could map onto the same network. So there is no uniquely optimal set of communities, is the point that I want to make here. And there's no uniquely optimal algorithm for detecting communities. So this motivates looking at different approaches when we try to look at communities and networks. So just to summarize really quickly, and then I'll step down, the goal of my talk was not to give you a definitive roadmap. I don't think I did that. However, I did want to convince you that detecting communities and networks is really challenging. There are lots of decisions we have to make along the way in terms of parameterization and null models and so forth, and that despite this, we can embrace these decisions and actually make our methods more flexible to accommodate our own research questions. And with that, I want to say thanks to people who have supervised me in the past, and also I want to note that I'm starting my lab in the fall of 2018, so very soon, in recruiting both postdocs and graduate students. So if you're interested in working on network neuroscience-related questions in the Psychological and Brain Sciences Department at Indiana University in conjunction with the Network Science Institute, please let me know and we can talk further.